What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today we are going to be doing part 9 or 10, somewhere in there. I'll put up what part it is now, of how to TIG weld, and we're going to focus on doing fillet welds. So let's get into it. So hopefully this is not your first video that you've seen in this series, and if it is, well, welcome, and hopefully you go back and watch the ones that predate this. And the reason I say that is if you're trying to learn to TIG weld by jumping on fillet welds, you're in for a rude awakening. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can do whatever you want, but trying to learn the basics of TIG welding by doing this isn't really an economical means of learning. So you're better off starting with beads on plate and watching the earlier videos. Anyways, let's get into the topic at hand, which is fillet welds, which for those who don't know, some people call it a T-joint, but basically you have an upright plate and a bottom plate, and we're welding this in the flat position. And very simple to do this. However, if you haven't mastered the basics with TIG, aka arc gap control, your travel speed control, your tungsten angle, your filler rod addition, all of those things you really need to have a good handle on before you go and start doing this, because you're just going to end up scrapping a lot of metal that would otherwise be decent. So for the setup that I'm going to be using, I'm going to be using 1/8 inch material. If you have thinner stuff, that's all right. If you have thicker stuff, that's perfectly fine as well. I find that 1/8 or 3.2 mil works really good because you can put a lot of heat into this stuff and you don't melt through, so it's not as frustrating as, say, 1/16 or 1.5, 1.6 mil plates. So you can put more heat into it, and when you weld one side, you can oftentimes go back and with minimal prep, weld the other side. When you get into thinner material, you're going to have melt through, and if you attempt to weld over that due to the scale, you're just going to end up getting a terrible looking weld and probably porosity. So this material or thicker generally works pretty good. Amperage wise, we're going to be, I don't know, I'll set the machine for 140 amps, maybe more, and then we're going to use the pedal to control it. If you're doing lift start or scratch start, I would suggest somewhere around 100 to 120 amps for this. Now for filler size, I have 1/16 or 1.6 mil filler. You can use thinner filler. I would not recommend bigger than this. And I don't know why, but a lot of places, for some reason, like Harbor Freight, for example, they only sell 3/32 rod. And for steel, that's really too big to be welding a lot of crap like this, simply because you're going to need too much heat to melt that rod and you're going to end up making cold welds. So 0.45 or 1/16 filler is what I would recommend. Before I get into the actual welding, let's do some quick book learning so we're all on the same page. Depicted here is a common fillet weld or a T-joint, depending on what you call it. These are deceptively difficult to weld when you're new, because guess what? If you've done lap welds, those you can melt the edge of the plates off. So if you have two plates like this, bad habits can be formed because you can just melt this off and make a decent looking weld. However, there is no edge to melt off on this. Therefore, most people, after they switch from doing lap welds or just straight butt welds, their beads, I guess, look like crap on this. There's no other way to put it. And that's because, well, if your arc wanders over to this upright plate or down here instead of directly in the corner, you're going to undercut it where it chews into the steel, and it's going to look bad. Not to mention, you have to have a pretty steady hand to do even a 3 to 4 inch long weld that's perfectly straight right where you want it. So the biggest thing here, you want to focus your tungsten to be right at this corner, and you want the angle to be more or less at 45 degrees. This isn't even 45 degrees. It would be more like this angle right here, to where that arc cone is hitting up to here and to here. And your gap from this inside corner to the tip of the tungsten needs to be about whatever your filler rod is. So about 1.6 millimeter, 1/16 of an inch, maybe ever so slightly more. You can't be bringing this tungsten way out, because then the arc cone will be way out here, and you're just going to undercut everything. You're not going to fuse this together. So you want that in there super tight. And again, for if you're going to do, say this is 1/4 inch, and obviously this is more like 1 inch, but let's say it's 1/4 inch. If you're welding 1/4 inch thick steel, your root pass, you want to be a small, tight, super penetrating, where it's melting all of this in here pass. You don't want to try and put down a huge amount of metal in one shot on a root pass. I mean, that goes with kind of any kind of process on thicker plate, but you want to make sure things are fused with a nice tight arc. And then if you need to put more reinforcement due to how thick the material is, then you come back and do an extra weave or multiple passes over it, multiple stringers. So what you need to focus on this exercise is basically getting a super tight small weld. And that's TIG in a nutshell. So many people that are learning TIG that have experience with stick and MIG, they treat it like that, and they try and look for welds that are super big, aka they're using big filler rods, high amperage, and long arc gaps, and that is not what TIG is designed for. TIG is a very precise process, low metal deposition, and very slow, and you need to focus on that more than anything in this exercise. Now, 1/8 inch 1.6 mil plate, or excuse me, 3.2 millimeter plate, do you need to do multiple passes? No. You could single pass that and it would be acceptable in weld size. So that's not really a huge issue. However, it wouldn't hurt if you guys go and do a pass here and then do another stringer when it cools down, and another, to where you have a 3-pass weld. It will be oversized for the material, but you get more practice out of what you have. I can't stress enough when you're learning to do this how important it is to find a decent hand position to actually attempt to do this. And let me show you. So how you hold the TIG torch is really critical in being able to do fillet welds. Now this torch is a flex neck. The neck flexes, thus the name. You may have a rigid neck where it's more or less fixed like this, and that's all right. You can work with that. The thing is that you're going to have to reposition your hands in a manner to where you can actually weld it. With this, I like it because I can bend the neck and not have to change my angles as much. So like I could weld this like this, and you see how my angle is maintaining the same the whole length, okay? When you run a rigid neck where it's like this, if I try and do that, look at the angle. I'm hitting the flat plate. So you end up having to angle it more like this in order to get the proper angle there. So it's something to be aware of. It's so common for people because, let's face it, when you're welding, you can't really see what your body's doing because you're paying attention to what you should, the molten puddle, right? Well, you might be doing all sorts of weird things like this where your tungsten is pointed in the wrong direction and not even realize it. And that's why it's kind of important maybe when learning this to have a buddy or something watch you and make sure that you're not like doing this. If you're doing this, you're never going to fuse anything together. You're going to hit that bottom plate. But like I said, if you get your tungsten angle, you want a slight push angle, just like this. And if you have to angle your torch like this, so be it. Grip-wise, so many people, they have a death grip on this sucker, and when you hold this tight, it's very difficult to move. Okay, so you want to hold this fairly loose in your hands, and I tend to hold it much like a cigar or a pencil and just slide my hand on the table. This is one of those things where this is not something you want to try and do like this. Don't get me wrong, I've done it and you can do it, but it's so much harder to be steady doing that. So I tend to prefer, like I said, the cigar hold. You get it in there super tight, and then your travel speed is actually fairly slow. This is not a stick like 7018, and it is definitely not MIG. Your travel speed, you have to give things time to melt and fuse. When it comes to adding filler, and this is definitely a weld that you would want to add filler to because a fusion weld is not really too bright to do on this because it's more or less just undercut. What I personally do is set the filler on my middle finger and my thumb, and then I more or less feed it. If you don't know how to do this, I have a video dealing with this earlier on in the series, link in the description. So anyways, I tend, if I'm welding a very short joint like this, I will have my fingers about 2 to 3 inches away from the end, maybe a little bit more. And I come in at an angle that is about a 90-degree angle to the TIG tungsten. Okay, so if you look here, and this is probably a bad example, this is a little bit better. So I would come in with the filler rod just touching the surface of the plate and dab it into the molten puddle. I'm not coming in flat like this. If you come in super flat with a leading tungsten angle, you're going to end up melting the wire to the plate and you won't be able to retract it. Not to mention, if you're not running enough amperage and you do this, you're going to end up just bridging the two pieces of metal and you're not going to have any root fusion. So like the lay wire technique, you have to be very, very careful with that you're not just melting the wire and not fusing anything in the root. So I'll come in here, push some filler, retract it a little bit. The purpose of retracting it is to allow that heat to melt in that root to where you can visually see it. And then I will push a little bit more in, retract it a little bit, and I just motor on just like that. It takes skill and it takes time to develop that. You're going to need to practice that a lot. At this point, if you've watched the rest of the videos I put out there and practiced and did everything I said, you won't find this too complicated, but expect to have a bunch of problems at first. The last thing we need to be on the same page about before we go and actually do some welding has to do with cup sizes. Now, if you've been around TIG welding or Instagram for any amount of time, a lot of guys run these super big 12, size 14 or number 10 cups, and that's fine. That's great for doing roll cages and a lot of stuff like outside corner joints where you have poor gas shielding. When you're welding fillet welds at a straight 90 or even tighter than that, running a big cup, you can run into downsides to it. So I tend to run on a fillet weld like this on normal steel, a number 7 or a number 8 cup with a fairly close stick out. Okay, now this is kind of a bad example because of how I drew it. Tungsten's a little limp noodle here, but anyways, what'll happen is there's a point where you can run so big of a cup that in order to keep the cup off the plate, you have to run like a 3/4 or 1 inch stick out, and you're probably going to have worse shielding than if you just used a number 7 and a closer stick out. Now in this poorly drawn picture, the tungsten stick out is about the same other than the fact that one is dipped in the metal there. But in real life, you're going to find that for a lot of fillet welds, just run a number 7 or number 8 with a slight push angle and get it in there fairly tight, and you'll be able to run 12 to 15 CFH of argon with a gas lens rather than the 30 CFH that something like this requires just to get adequate shielding. So that's a tip that you can use on this as well as TIG welding in general. Not everything you need, not everything you weld needs to have something like that big of a cup. And don't get me wrong, I got a whole drawer full of them and I use them all the time for stuff like roll cages and all sorts of intricate work. But for just doing practice, save yourself the money on all that argon that would be wasted, because this traps all that argon, all the argon gas. Argon's heavier than air, remember that, and it's going to stay in this area. It's not going to leave. So this is one of those cases where less sometimes is more. All right, well, let's go and do some actual welding. So don't worry, I'm still here. This video I slowed down to 40% so we can talk about some of the finer details. We'll watch it in real time after it's done. So I light up the arc. I'm waiting for a puddle to establish. I want that puddle to bridge the gap between both pieces. Once it does that, or is close, I'll add a dab of filler. And then as I move that puddle along, I'm pushing it with a slight tungsten angle. I'm just dabbing the filler in there. Now this, I'm not adding enough filler to bring that bead out to where the throat depth of it is very thick. And we'll talk more about that later, but this is just touching the rod to the leading edge of the puddle. This is what you want to practice at first. Now, I don't know if you notice what I noticed, but you see all of that like scale and material that's moving around near the puddle and how that puddle isn't super crisp and clean? That base material isn't clean enough. And I'll show you an arc footage shortly where everything is perfectly clean and that's more desirable. When you see stuff like that, you need to clean your material better. Well, let's watch that in real time now. So now we're going to watch another one in slow motion where everything kind of goes right. This is what you should be aiming for, but obviously it's going to be pretty difficult for you to achieve this at first because you don't have the skill necessary to do this. So again, I light up on the edge there and I'm waiting for a puddle to establish and join the two pieces, and then I'm pushing a little bit of rod in there. And I'm more or less still dabbing it here. I'm not pushing a huge amount in. And again, this is what you should focus on at first. Now you notice all of that material floating around in the puddle is gone. Nothing is peeling off the base material. This is what you should see, and it means your material is clean and your argon shielding is exactly what you want it. Again, I'm pushing the puddle a little bit. If you notice, there's like a triangle shape to that puddle. It follows both the bottom and top plate and then more or less hits a point at the center of the root. This is what you want to see. If your puddle is like a boomerang shape on steel, then your arc gap is probably too long or you're not running enough amperage. You want that super hot, super focused triangle shaped puddle, and you want to just slowly push it along. You notice how my tungsten arc gap is staying consistent. Everything looks good here. You don't see the light output getting brighter or darker. That's another telltale sign that my arc gap is staying consistent like I need it to. Now at the end of the weld, I'm tapering off before I even get there. Well, let's look at that in real time. For this next clip, we're going to look at just a flat out inconsistency, and this is what you're going to probably see in your welds and in your welding when you're first trying to attempt to TIG weld. So I started the puddle up. You notice a little bit of porosity there, kind of bubbling. That's a great sign of poor material prep, possibly bad argon coverage as well. You don't want to see that. Things are going okay here. I'm dabbing the filler in, but you're going to watch how I'm going to wander with the tungsten up and down the plates a little bit, and that's because I don't have smooth travel speed and I don't have the tungsten angle pointed exactly at the dead center of that joint. This is undesirable because as you wash that material up and down on the plates, you're going to produce the potential for undercut, and your weld is just going to look very inconsistent. You won't have straight lines. You're more or less going to have a wave to it. And the arc gap also will change, and that will affect your penetration in the root. So by wandering like that, you're more or less going to fuse more into the upright and flat plates than you are in the root, and that's not good. It gets worse as it goes on, and you can see there how wide it's getting. Just everything is inconsistent. You want to keep that arc gap the same. You want to keep it, the tungsten pointed directly at that root. You don't want to be bouncing around. and I'll show you what this actually looks like on a weld. This is a weld that you just saw happen, and you can see that even though in the video it didn't look like I was wandering that much, a correct TIG weld is on the left of that, and just that little bit of wandering chewed away higher and lower on that plate, and that's undesirable. That weld is going to be more or less very concave, very little throat depth, and it just doesn't look that good. So by keeping a tighter arc, focusing it on the dead center of that root where the plates intersect, will produce a weld like the left third rather than what's on the right. The devil is in the details with TIG. It requires very, very consistent hand movements, and that's something that you can't expect to master overnight. It takes time to develop that. Well, let's look at that in real time. So I didn't mention this earlier, and I'm an idiot, so now's a great time to talk about it, and that is having a concave weld. TIG is notorious for making a very concave weld where your throat depth, which the throat depth is from this point to the center face of that weld, that distance can shorten up significantly like this if you do not push enough filler. So it is absolutely critical that you actually push some filler in there and you don't just touch the filler to the molten pool and think you're good, because your bead will look like this. There will be no reinforcement, minimal fusion, and you get the picture on that. Now, TIG welding in general, because of how the arc works, generally will have a concave profile. It is very difficult to produce more or less like a flat bead like this, like you would see with maybe spray arc or dual shield. However, you need to push enough filler to where you don't have something that looks like this. You would want something more like this, and not this far up. So again, somewhere right here. So very small, but a little bit convex is okay. And that's why it's so important with your arc gap. If this is your tungsten, the further away you pull this, the more the molten metal will wick over to here and up to here, and your bead will be something like this, except again, it's going to be more or less like this thick. Like there's no reinforcement from the throat depth of it. This looks good if the weld ended here and here, but coming up this far, you know what I'm saying? I think you get the picture on this. All right, let's go back to welding. So now we're going to watch me in real time weld this joint out. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to is how I'm just dabbing the filler with my left hand and I am not feeding anything. This is very common for new TIG welders that don't know how to feed properly, that they just dab into there. The problem with doing this is it's going to produce a very concave bead, and that's undesirable because the throat depth of that weld is going to be very thin, and unless you go back and fix that with another pass, your weld is going to be weaker than it should be. Don't get me wrong, it'll still have strength to it, but it's not anywhere near what it could be. And again, I'm not feeding it, I'm just dabbing it. Now on very thin material, you might be able to get away with this, but not on 3.2 mil, 3.5 mil and thicker, or about 1/8 and thicker. You're not going to get away with this on a fillet weld and have proper reinforcement. Here's a side shot of that weld, and you can see how the toe comes way out on the bottom plate, and it actually goes quite a bit up on the top plate. But the throat depth of that really isn't there. So simply a tighter arc and a little pinch more filler would have more or less brought the toe line in closer to the root and brought the throat depth of it, so the throat of the weld, out more. Here's another photo of the same weld, and you can see very concave and due to the tungsten angle not hitting the root at a 45, it more or less is slumped down on the bottom plate. Everything else is looking pretty consistent. The toe line isn't too bad, but simply holding a little bit too long of an arc and not pushing enough filler really kind of screwed up our throat depth of the weld. So be aware of that, pay attention to it, and if in doubt, cut your material in half and visually look at it. Well, let's go back to making mistakes now. So once again, this is slowed down. We're going to watch as I run a little bit too long of an arc gap, and I'm also going to aim the tungsten too high, and rather than aiming at the root, I'm going to aim at the top plate, and you're going to see exactly what happens when you do that. So I got the molten puddle started. The little bit too long of an arc gap, it's not too long, and I'm probably running a little bit too little of amperage. As I push that filler in and aim too high, you're going to watch, you're going to get like a weird cold toe, inconsistent toe on the bottom, and that's because the arc is focused more or less on the top plate and likely a little bit too low of amperage. But when you start seeing stuff like this, you need to bring that tungsten down. You don't need to be welding that top plate. You need it to fuse both the top and the bottom plate. And here I bring it down quite a bit, which is good, but I'm still kind of inconsistent with my travel speed, with my arc gap, and all those things just, it's going to screw up your weld. So again, the more consistent your arc gap, your travel speed, and your tungsten angle is, the better you're going to weld. Let's watch that in real time now. So this one's going to be a fun screw up. I ran not nearly enough amperage. The previous ones were at 120, 130 amps. Now we're talking 90 amps. So I lit up on the material. There's barely a puddle forming between the two, and I go and try and dab to it, and it more or less starts splitting the puddle where you have two puddles, one puddle on the plate, one on the bottom plate. When you see stuff like this, you're just running flat out not enough amperage. Everything becomes harder when you don't run the proper heat input, the proper amperage for what you're welding. Now, had I shoved that tungsten way in there, so super tight, and used a smaller filler rod, I could have probably welded this okay, but not with the arc gap that I'm running, and with the 1/16, the 1.6 mil filler. It's just not going to happen here. And you're going to watch, I'm going to kind of stop at a moment, increase the amperage significantly, and everything will magically work better. And as you can see, more amperage and then tightening the arc gap up right there, everything just flat out works better. It's looking good, the toes are nice and clean, the molten puddle's the shape of a triangle, I'm fusing the root. This is what you want to see, not that crap at the first part of this weld. So let's watch it in real time. So we all made it together through this whole lesson. That's awesome. And you, yes, you have a ton of practice to do. If you really want to get good at TIG welding, you must master the fillet weld. You don't have a choice. Half of what you would probably weld in the real world is some form of fillet weld, especially like roll cages and stuff like that. Now, I mean, if you can do lap welds decent, you probably won't find this too hard. But again, the attention to detail that you must have to do quality work with this is pretty significant, and it's going to take a lot of practice. Now, this is probably still too hot for me to hold, But something I didn't mention, when it comes to material, if you just do stuff like this and then the back gets all oxided and welds poorly, how much practice are you really getting? Well, the smarter thing to do would be to weld a flat plate on the top like this and then keep going to where you more or less have 4 fillet welds, 2 on clean metal, 2 on not so clean material, rather than just taking this and throwing it in a round file. I mean, it's a waste of material, so that'll save you a little bit. And no, you don't have to use this tall of material. You can definitely use thinner material in height than this to save. And there's a lot of other ways too that you could save on material versus doing it this way. I mean, you could use thicker material and just do like 20 passes to get used to it. All those things help. And I expect you guys to practice 30 to 40 of these until you really can make a consistent bead on these. And please do not try and step super far forward and add filler to make the big stack of dimes look. You want a smooth ripple pattern. You don't want that high peak and valley between the dimes, because that's going to be a lack of reinforcement and you're making weaker welds than what you should have. So please avoid that, like I had said earlier. Now beyond that, I have a bunch of other tests, and I guess not really tests, but exercises for you to do that are going to be a lot of fun and very, very challenging. So it's in your best interest to master this the best you can, and then go on to the next video where we're going to do some really cool, fun welds, as fun as this can be. So anyways, thanks for sticking around for the video. Until next time.